rather expressed its reluctance to try a de facto pope under any circumstances. Ennodius, the official defender of this council, frankly laid down the principle that the occupant of the see of Rome could be judged by none but God. It was probably about this time that forgery and interpolation began to be resorted to with a view of giving to these claims some appearance of antiquity. The acts of the supposed Council of Sinuessa, which desired Pope Marcinellus, accused of sacrificing to idols, to judge himself, as being alone competent in such a case, are no doubt a forgery. So is the constitution attributed to Sylvester and Constantine, which declares the Roman see above the judgment of any human tribunal. So is the supposed report of the trial of Sixtus III. Cyprian's treatise on the unity of the Church had been altered to suit the views of the Roman see before the time of Pelagius II. It was at this time, too, that the Roman bishops began to claim the title of Pope, which however for some generations was also given to the incumbents of other apostolic sees. But the popes still admitted that they were subject to general councils, nor did they claim jurisdiction over other bishops, unless they were brought before them as the highest court of appeal. So long as the Roman see agreed with them in hostility to Constantinople, the Gothic kings were willing to allow them a large measure of freedom. But when the popes came to an agreement with the see of Constantinople, they became much more suspicious and watchful of their movements. John I having, contrary to the traditions of his see, paid a visit to Constantinople, where he was received with the utmost distinction, was on his return regarded by Theoderic as a traitor and thrown into prison, where, after languishing for nearly a year, he died. The kings also interfered actively in the elections to the papacy, and even nominated the person to be elected. Theoderic nominated Felix III, and Athalaric issued an edict against bribery in papal and episcopal elections. Still, even so the Gothic domination was not so perilous to the papacy as the restoration of imperial rule which followed Justinian's conquest of Italy. Justinian, it is true, paid great respect to the see of Rome, but he paid like honour to that of Constantinople, and was not unwilling to use one against the other. His object was, in short, to extend his own power over Church as well as State. Pope Silverius was deposed and banished by desire of the Empress Theodora, Vigilius installed in his place by command of Belisarius, and when Vigilius, after a miserable life, sank into an unhonoured grave, Pelagius was elevated to the see by command of Justinian, an appointment so unpopular that the new pope was actually unable to induce 3 bishops to take part in his consecration. In many ways the popes were made to feel the bitterness of dependence on the Byzantine court. They were forced into heresy, or what seemed to be heresy, and on this account a large part of Italy withdrew from their communion. The sees of Milan and Ravenna were reconciled after a comparatively short interval, but that of Aquileia was more resolute, and it was not until the year 698 that it re-entered into communion with Rome. The dependence of Rome on Byzantium was brought to an end by the Lombard invasion. The dominions of the Greek Empire in Italy were thenceforth limited to Rome, Ravenna, and a part of southern Italy. This province was governed by exarchs seated at Ravenna. The authority of the emperors declined in Rome, and passed almost insensibly to the popes, many of whom were very capable of sustaining it. The Byzantine sovereigns being often too weak to defend their distant province, the Italians had to defend themselves; and at their head in this struggle was the Pope of Rome, the person of highest dignity in the city, the natural protector of the Catholics against the Arian Lombards, and the greatest landowner in Italy. For the estates of the see had been growing since the time when Constantine permitted bishops, as such, to receive gifts and legacies, and were in the 6th century of great extent. The prelates of that age appear to have been good landlords, and to have spent their revenues freely for the public good. For 27 years, says Gregory the Great, the popes had lived in the midst of Lombard swords, and all that time their income had been drawn upon for the clergy, the monasteries, the poor; for the wants of the people generally and for defence against the Lombards. As was natural, the see gained infinitely in dignity and influence, and became, in matters ecclesiastical, less and less dependent on the Byzantine court. Under the influence of many causes the see of Rome had risen to a great and unrivalled position in the West, and at the end of the sixth century the way was prepared for Gregory the Great, with whom a new era begins. It must not, however, be supposed that the views of the Roman bishops as to the authority of Rome were universally accepted even in the West. Many churches had grown up independently of Rome, and were abundantly conscious of the greatness of their own past. Milan, for instance, a great city and the chief town of a civil diocese, always maintained a certain attitude of independence towards Rome, and the authority of so powerful a prelate as Ambrose contributed greatly to render its see practically patriarchal. The see of Ravenna, too, from the time when Honorius, fleeing from the Goths, made that city his capital, was not disposed to acknowledge in Rome a supremacy in ecclesiastical matters which it had ceased to possess politically. And in the African Church the reluctance to submit to Roman dictation which had showed itself in Cyprian's time was maintained for many generations. In the Pelagian controversy the Africans firmly opposed Zosimus of Rome, who had taken the side of Pelagius. And when the same Zosimus tried to compel them to reinstate a deprived presbyter, Apiarius, who had appealed to Rome, they were reluctant to obey. In vain he appealed to the canons of Sardica, which he quoted as Nicene; they rejoined that the canons in question were not Nicene, and admonished the bishop of Rome to proceed with more moderation and equity. And when Bishop Celestinus a few years later again urged the restoration of Apiarius, they most emphatically repudiated his authority, and forbade, under pain of excommunication, any appeal to a foreign bishop. They begged the bishop to consider whether it was probable that God would grant to an individual a power of correct judgment which he refused to a synod. But the course of events broke the spirit of the African churchmen. Their country was overrun by the Arian Vandals, and in their distress they were glad to cling to such support as they could find in Rome. They were not disposed to dispute the claims of Leo the Great as they had done those of Zosimus. In Gaul too there was a vigorous resistance to the jurisdiction of the see of St. Peter. The see of Arles, which was really ancient and claimed to be more ancient than it was, constantly asserted metropolitan rights, which were acknowledged at Rome. One of its most famous bishops, Hilary, felt himself strong enough to resist even Leo the Great, and refused to allow a sentence passed by himself and his provincial synod to be reviewed at Rome. In consequence of this contumacy Leo withdrew, so far as in him lay, the metropolitan privileges of Arles, and obtained, for he did not refuse to use the secular power when it was on his side, the famous rescript of the emperor Valentinian III, giving an emphatic supremacy to Rome over all churches, and enjoining provincial governors to compel the attendance of bishops who might be summoned thither. Practically, however, these proceedings do not seem in the end to have had much effect on the position and authority of the see of Arles, and when the Franks came to be rulers in Gaul the power of the popes in that country was much weakened, for the bishops were compelled to pay more respect to a liege lord close at hand than to an ecclesiastical superior at a distance who could not protect them from him. Similarly in Spain, after the conversion of the Gothic king to Catholic Christianity, the Archbishop of Toledo, supported by the civil power, was able to assert a large measure of independence for his province. The British Church, isolated by its position, seems to have had from the first a very loose connection with Rome, and after the withdrawal of the Roman troops scarcely any. Chapter 10.